All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started now. So thank you so much for everyone who has come out. I know it's lunchtime, and that's kind of like when people don't want to be in panels, but I really appreciate you all taking the time to come out here. This is my very first time doing this panel, and although I have done some practice rounds at home, obviously the first time you do it at a convention is kind of, a learning experience. Also, my voice is completely shot right now, so if my voice cracks or anything, please don't make fun of me. So, without further ado, what happened to Harvest Moon anyway? So in this panel, I want to talk about the history and the development of the series. I want to talk about the golden age of Harvest Moon, which I would assume most people in the audience who have played Harvest Moon games are probably most familiar with this sort of group of games, especially if you're like 30 or above. Usually when I encounter Harvest Moon fans, I will assume that you are at least 30. I am going to explain the Harvest Moon to Story of Seasons name change and why that happened and why that was especially confusing. I'm going to give some game recommendations if you either have never played anything or if you are re-entering kind of the series and wanting to play things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the future of the series and kind of the farming sim genre as a whole. And if I have time at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of some of the weird stuff in the game, because there's a lot of weird stuff in these games. So, hi, my name is Lexi. When I was in the 4th grade, my next door neighbor Lucy got a copy of Harvest Moon, More Friends of Mineral Town for Christmas, and she let me play a little bit of it, and I was just completely taken by it. I was obsessed. I went home and I begged my mom to buy me a copy as well, and then a month later for my birthday, I got a copy, and here I am 20 years later. Tomorrow is my birthday, so this is basically like my 20-year anniversary with the series. And I have been thinking about it every single day since then. And I really have to thank this man, Wada Yasuhiro, who is the creator of the series, for this huge impact that it's had on my life. And so he, back in the 90s, was really interested in developing a game that honed in on his sort of childhood nostalgia surrounding growing up kind of in the Japanese countryside and rural life, and really wanted to make a game kind of about that, because a lot of the games that were on the market at the time were platformers and fighting games. And there were still games like SimCity and Derby Stallion and things like that that were simulation games, but they were very focused on raw numbers and data. And he was really interested in the kind of human element that he could bring to a game. He wanted to be able to interact with people. He wanted to be able to build relationships in a game. And the fact that these games existed told him that there was, actual interest in doing that. And so he set about with a small team to start creating this game. And I think one of the things that's very appealing about the Harvest Moon games in general is that they're very sort of vague about their setting. I would say in many ways they are very kind of Western, like architecturally. You look at the town, you look at the names of characters, you look at how they dress, and it feels very Western. But there's still a lot of Japanese cultural influences. You have characters that are eating Japanese curry for meals. You have people are eating soba for New Year's, which is a very kind of Japanese tradition. And I think it's that kind of cultural vagueness that really allows people all over the world to connect with these games and really enjoy them. So he set about working on this game that was titled Bokujo Monogatari, which is usually abbreviated as Bokumono. It translates literally to ranch story. He had a very small team, and there were a lot of issues in the development of this game. One of the issues that they kept encountering was that there was a lot of frame rate problems, and they ended up having to revert to a much earlier build of the game just to get it to run properly. But in doing so, they lost a lot of progress, and that was very demoralizing for the team. And then later, towards kind of halfway through development, the company that they were working for went bankrupt. That's obviously a very big setback. It was later bought up by Victor Interactive, and Victor Interactive was interested in continuing developing this game, but they had very severe budget cuts, which set them back even further. And so it really is kind of a wonder that it even released in the first place. But it finally did in 1996 on the Super Famicom, or in North America, the Super Nintendo. And it was intended to be just a one-off game. It released towards the end of the Super Famicom lifespan. The Nintendo 64 had just come out a couple months prior, so it was not expected to sell well at all. But it ended up actually selling very, very quickly. Word of mouth was very important in kind of spreading the news about this game, and people were really taken by kind of the unique features with the combination of farming and interacting with the characters and other kind of features that they had not encountered in games before. I'm going to take a sip of water. So what makes these games what they are? So at the time, there were farming features in other games, but there were not any other farming sims as we think of them today. Today, that is such a kind of ubiquitous thing, but this was really the first farming sim in the modern sense. And so obviously you have farming, you can grow crops with varying levels of complexity depending on the game. Some of them go really hard with it, some of them it's you plant the seeds, you water the seeds, you pick the crops, you ship the crops. Wada was also really, really interested in cattle ranching, and so that was a feature that he wanted to incorporate into the game. And so raising animals is a feature that you find in all of these games. One thing to note is that you are never raising animals for slaughter. You are always exclusively raising animals for animal products such as milk, wool, cheese, cheese that you process from milk, or eggs. And you can get different animals depending on the game. Even in the ones where you can have a pig, you're not raising the pig to eat. You are raising the pig to find truffles for you. I said before also that Wada was really interested in the human element of the games. So one of the features that you find in basically all of the games, there's a couple where you can't, but you can get married and you can have a family. And you can interact with the town at large, and that kind of connection with other people was very important to him to incorporate in a game, and I think because that was also very unique at the time, that brought a lot of people in. That was the feature that I was most interested in as a child, and I tried so hard to hide it from my mom because I was so embarrassed that I was playing a romance game, but obviously she knew about it. When I gave this presentation to her last night, she was laughing because she knew that I hid this from her. These games also have kind of other activities like fishing and foraging and mining and various festivals depending on the game. There's a lot of fun ways that you can interact with the environment around you. And one thing that's kind of unique with these games is kind of the Harvest Goddess lore. Usually in most games, the Harvest Goddess is either a central figure or is in the background. In some games, you can interact with her directly. In some games, you are trying to save her or revive her. There are a couple games where she does not come up at all, but she is kind of a very present figure throughout the series. So the first Bokujo Monogatari game later picked up for release by Natsume in 1997, or picked up for a North American release by the localization company Natsume in 1997. And the sales were similar in the US. It was very, very popular. And one of the hardest things with getting started with a franchise or with an IP is kind of just getting your foot in the door. But once the audience is there is a demand for more games, and that's exactly what happened. Victor Interactive wanted more Harvest Moon games to be developed and released, and after Harvest Moon, just the original Harvest Moon, there was a Game Boy port, and then there were 2 new Game Boy Color games. But if you grew up playing Harvest Moon, I would assume that you most likely played one or several of these games during kind of the golden age of Harvest Moon games. So these are not in chronological order, but there is Harvest Moon: A Wonderful Life, there is Harvest Moon: Friends of Mineral Town, there's Harvest Moon 64, and there's Harvest Moon: Back to Nature. And those are really what I would consider the golden age. That's what people looks back on in their childhood that they played. So in 1999, Harvest Moon 64 was released on the Nintendo 64. In Japanese, it's actually just Bokujo Monogatari 2 because it is meant to be a direct sequel to the first Harvest Moon game. Even though there were games that came in between it, this one takes place in the same town. The characters that you interact with are the descendants of the characters from the first game. So it really is meant to be a direct sequel, despite the fact that there were other games that came in between it. It is very story-rich, and so it's one that has a lot of replay value because you really have to go through and play multiple times to get all of these different things. And it is, you know how people do that, like, oh, anime just isn't just for kids kind of thing. This one does actually cover some fairly dark topics that I'm not sure if I'm allowed to talk about. It is still an E-rated game, but it does cover some heavier topics, and I think that is kind of interesting for a lot of people, the fact that this children's game does it. Given it does it in a way similar to like how Avatar: The Last Airbender covers heavier topics, it does it in a way that is digestible to children. But especially when, as the series progresses through the years and it gets more worldwide appeal, you see a lot less of that, honestly. And so Harvest Moon 64 was massively successful. It is still cited as one of the best Harvest Moon games. I do recommend playing it. It is a little mechanically clunky playing it in 2025, but it is a very good game that I would recommend. And so because of the success of Harvest Moon 64, the studio really wanted to kind of get into the PlayStation market because the PlayStation was out at the time. And Harvest Moon: Back to Nature was developed, meant to be a kind of enhanced or upgraded port of Harvest Moon 64. In Japanese, it's Bokujo Monogatari Harvest Moon. It is the only Bokujo Monogatari game that directly references the name Harvest Moon. But this also released in 1999 on the PlayStation. Wada was not directly overseeing the project. He gave it to another team, and he basically said, this is an upgraded port, so you can add new dialogue and add new cutscenes and all of this. And then he came back to it much later while the team was working on it and was quite far along in development, and he found that a lot of things had changed about it. There were, new characters were in completely new jobs. They had different family relationships. The setting was very different. And at that stage, it was kind of too late to roll that back. And so he did kind of eventually sign off on those changes. But this marks the first in what would become a trend of reusing character names, concepts, assets in games over and over again, to the point where it kind of creates these different timelines. If you look at like a Harvest Moon game timeline, there's all these branching things specifically because of these different settings and the way that these exact same characters have been reused again and again. So, Harvest Moon: Friends of Mineral Town, this is where I got started. It uses the same characters and setting as Harvest Moon: Back to Nature, but it is on the Game Boy Advance, so it does not use the same assets because obviously they had to remake it for a handheld console at the time. This is one that, again, I have a lot of nostalgia for because this is where I started, and it's one that people will recommend quite a bit. There's not too much I can say here besides that it is a very, very good game, and I think of it very dearly. And kind of the final game that I would consider to be in the golden age of Harvest Moon games is Harvest Moon: A Wonderful Life. This was released in 2003 on the GameCube. It was meant to be more of a kind of realistic take on farming, as much as you can do in a children's game. For example, in real life, when you milk a cow, you can only milk a cow for a very kind of short period of time after it has given birth, like generally like 10 months. But in most Harvest Moon games, you can buy a cow from the store and just milk it indefinitely. The cow doesn't even need to give birth at all. But in Harvest Moon: A Wonderful Life, they kind of implemented that feature. You have a very set window that you can milk your cow, and then if you want to milk your cow again after that, you have to take it to get impregnated and have it give birth to a calf, at which point your cow, you can't do anything with it. This one also, the main focus of the game is really on raising your child and interacting with your family. This is, I think, the only Harvest Moon game that does require you to get married. There's a Rune Factory game where you're required to get married, but this is the only Harvest Moon game that does that. And really because the focus is on this slow progression of family life. You go through your entire lifespan as the character. You get to see your child grow up. You get to influence your child in different ways and interact with your spouse. One thing that I really appreciate about the series is that they have historically been very experimental with what they do with their games. A lot of the games are very, very different, and this was a very different game. I think it's a wonderful game, but it is very slow-paced. So I also want to talk a little bit about kind of the demographics shift throughout the years with the games. So with the first games in the series, you could only play as a male player character, and you could only be a heterosexual male character because gay people did not exist at this point, obviously. And one of the things that they started doing through the years is they would release the male version of the game, and then sometime later they would release a female version of the game where you played as a female character and you could pursue male characters for marriage. What's kind of interesting about this, though, is that the bachelorette characters, the characters that you could marry as a male player character, they were specifically designed to be cute and enticing and attractive, and you want to marry them. They're interesting, they're appealing. And in most Harvest Moon games, you have this sort of rival feature. So you have a character that you're interested in, you have also a rival for that character's affections. And when they and the rival characters, though, they were not designed to be attractive, appealing characters. Many of them are kind of frumpy, quite honestly. But when they started making the games for female player characters, they're like, okay, well, we have to repurpose these characters to be marriageable. And so what you found a lot through the years is that there would always be one or two characters per game that were the conventionally attractive sad boy type that people would really latch on to. So like in Back to Nature and Friends of Mineral Town, it's Gray. People really like Gray. In A Wonderful Life, I don't think A Wonderful Life really had well, yeah, in his remake design, he's hot, but like, his original design, he looks so greasy in his original design. He looks very frumpy. But these rival characters then had to be repurposed to be marriageable characters, and it shows, is what I would say. It was not until they started combining the games rather than separating them that there's a very clear kind of distinction where you could tell that the male characters were explicitly designed to also be characters for you to marry rather than just designed as your rivals. So now we get to the 10-year anniversary. There were some games that came out in between kind of the golden age of Harvest Moon games and before that. But the 10-year anniversary, they really wanted to go all out with it. And this is where you start seeing those combined games. And so they released 3 different games for the 10-year anniversary. The first of which is Harvest Moon Island of Happiness, which was released in 2007 on the DS. You as the player character are shipwrecked on an island and you have to build it up from scratch. This was not the first Harvest Moon game to come out on the DS, but it was the first to very heavily use the DS touchscreen, because this was that era of time where every DS game wanted to like super hone in on the touchscreen. People did not like this. I am an ardent defender of Harvest Moon Island of Happiness. You can ask me why, I will always defend it later. But what it comes down to, this game was received very poorly, and it did not sell super well. And so you get yet another example of the characters from this game, the assets and the characters, being repurposed for another game later. The characters were pulled from this game to be released on Harvest Moon Island of Happiness a year later, or Sunshine Islands a year later in 2008, which was much better received, but it uses the same characters in a different setting, and it does not use the touchscreen. There was also Innocent Life. So Innocent Life is not technically a Harvest Moon game, but it was a game that was developed for the 10-year anniversary. Its tagline is a futuristic Harvest Moon. It released in 2006 on the PSP and was later ported to the PS2. You play as a robot character who gets to farm, and it is very story-rich. You're trying to save this island. It does not have marriage in it, because you're a robot, and I guess robots can't get married now. It would not stop me, but I personally think that this is one of the reasons that it did not do as well, because people really liked the marriage feature, and not having that, I think, steered a lot of people away. And it did receive very mixed reviews as well. And this was released it was intended as a one-off game, and as of now, only one game has been released for it. However, there's also Rune Factory. Rune Factory was also developed as a one-off 10-year anniversary game for Harvest Moon. It has the tagline, A Fantasy Harvest Moon, and the first game through the third game on their DS release all had that tagline of A Fantasy Harvest Moon. So they are very clearly capitalizing on that brand recognition. In Rune Factory, you play as an amnesiac who is given a farm, and mechanically, it does function very similar to a traditional Harvest Moon game in that you get to grow crops, you get to, instead of raising animals, you can tame monsters and get products from monsters, so you can get eggs and wool. But it also features dungeon crawling and fighting boss monsters and whatnot. So it is more of a fantasy RPG. It is basically a fantasy Harvest Moon. And this was also intended just as a one-off game, but it ended up being very, very well received and was very popular. And so this went on to span its entire own franchise. I'm trying to think of how many games there are. There's 5 mainline series games, and then there's two soon to be 3 side games. So honestly, Rune Factory would be its own entirely separate panel.
There's 6 Rune Factory games.
There's Rune Factory 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's Rune Factory Frontier. There's Rune Factory Tides of Destiny, and then coming out in May there is Rune Factory Guardians of Azuma. I have to count on my fingers. It's coming out May 31st. They did change the date for it. Yeah. Honestly, Rune Factory would be its own entirely separate panel that I would love to do, and I will probably submit next year, and hopefully I will get accepted. So this went on for a little while. There were more games that came out after this, but around 2013, 2014 is when the split happened, which is basically the Marvelous Natsume breakup. So Bokujo Monogatari was initially released by Victor Interactive, which later merged with Marvelous Entertainment, and the company Natsume handled localization outside of Japan until 2013. But Marvelous decided that they wanted to do translation in-house with the publisher Xseed, which they had done with Rune Factory previously. So they kind of broke up. However, Natsume retained the rights to the name Harvest Moon, and they began publishing their own original games with the Harvest Moon title and branding, whereas Marvelous needed to start rebranding the Bokujo Monogatari games with a different name, which was Story of Seasons. What ended up happening is that Natsume would start timing their new releases of their original Harvest Moon games, their Natsume Moon games, if you will, with Story of Seasons games. So what happened? Take a little. So in 2014, Natsume released their original Harvest Moon, The Lost Valley. I knew about all of these changes, and I still decided to give it a fair chance. It was very, very bad. You should not play it. I've heard that some of the newer Natsume Moon games have been a lot better, but I was so soured by this experience that I didn't really want to go back and play it. But you can see side by side the difference between the original Natsume developed Harvest Moon game versus the very first that's just Story of Seasons, the original Bokujo Monogatari game that also came out that same year. One thing to note is that this split did not happen really in Japan. The games in Japan are continue to be published with the Bokujo Monogatari name. So this is something that really affected the Western fan base much more. I think what ended up happening, do you have a...
I was wondering what the Harvest Moon games are called in Japan then, the Natsume ones.
They are not released in Japan. Yeah. Yeah, they are not released in Japan at all. Natsume did previously develop a couple original Harvest Moon games before the split that were Harvest Moon puzzle games, which I actually think are quite fun. Harvest Moon Frantic Farming is very fun. I really enjoy it if you like puzzle games. But that was an original developed Natsume Harvest Moon game before the split that also was not released in Japan. But I think what happened with a lot of people, so Harvest Moon has always had kind of, I would say, an aging fan base. It does not pull in a lot of new people. And so that's why when someone says that they are a Harvest Moon fan to me, I assume that they are around the age of 30 or older. I'm in a server, actually. I think I'm making eye contact with someone else in the server. And there is someone that I talk to a lot who really liked Harvest Moon Magical Melody. And I'm turning 28 tomorrow, and so I assumed that this person was around the same age as me. I later found out that they were actually a 16-year-old in high school, and that was just complete whiplash, because what 16-year-old grew up playing Harvest Moon Magical Melody, you know? But so unlike games like Rune Factory, which have been better, even though it's a niche game, I would say Rune Factory has been a lot better about bringing in new players, whereas the Harvest Moon Story of Seasons fan base really has been this core aging and older fan base. It does bring in some new players, but not as frequently, mainly because of just the proliferation of the farming sim genre as a whole. Now, the split was a very big deal, and just a couple years later, in 2016, Stardew Valley was released. And in many ways, the Bokumono series, I think, didn't really fully recover from the split. I think that the new Natsume Moon games kind of soured the image of Harvest Moon for a lot of people. People who may have played it as a child, they saw a Natsume Moon game in the stores and they thought, oh, I used to love these games as a kid. I'm going to pick this up and play it. And then they took it home and played it and they're like, wow, this really sucks. And they might not have known about the split. They might not have known about Story of Seasons being, you know, the true Harvest Moon. But Stardew Valley came out in 2016. And it really kind of built on the foundation of the series. The creator has been very forthright about talking about being very inspired by Harvest Moon, and you can see this in a lot of different ways in the game. But Stardew Valley came out almost 10 years ago, and it's just a single game, and it has still had this lasting power. And I think such a big part of that is because, one, there's so many mods and things that you can do with it. It has co-op. Some Harvest Moon games have had some very, very basic co-op, but not really fleshed out yet. I will talk about that in a moment. And just the fact that it built on the foundation, but it did new and innovative and interesting things with it in ways that people felt like they had kind of been missing from Harvest Moon games as time went on. And it still has that lasting power. And now the farming sim genre is a genre. It's not just Harvest Moon. For a very long time, if you heard farming game, it would be Harvest Moon. And now you have so many different options. Again, we have Stardew Valley, there's the My Time series, there's Fields of Mystria, which is in beta right now, which is very popular. And there are so many different options. And it's mostly indie games. And I think the fact that it is mostly indie games is what allows developers to be very creative and innovative with what they're able to do with it. That's my feeling, that's my kind of theorizing. But if you are a returning player, or if you have never played a Harvest Moon game in your life, these are the ones that are immediately in your grasp right now, in the sense of you can go to a retailer and buy them, or you can download them on the Switch eShop. So, take another sip of water.
Some of them are also on Steam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're also on Steam. Not all of them, but most of these are.
My knowledge count is really bad on Steam. Get it on Switch.
Is it? I only play things on Switch, so I like my little handheld games. But I did talk at length about Harvest Moon 64, which is available on the Nintendo 64 Virtual Console on the Switch, which is apparently not actually called the Virtual Console, but that's always what I'm going to call it. Anyway, you can access it very easily that way. There is also Story of Seasons, Friends of Mineral Town. This is the Switch remake of Harvest Moon, Friends of Mineral Town, originally released on the Game Boy Advance. This came out in 2019 on the Switch, and it is a remake. It is a very straightforward remake. It introduces 2 new marriage candidates, and you can be gay now, because that's allowed. However, it does not introduce many new features. It doesn't introduce really many new cutscenes. And if you feel very nostalgic about the original Game Boy game, like I do, like I loved it, but the reality is it kind of feels a little outpaced by things that come out today, because this is such a straightforward remake. This is one that I believe is also available on Steam, and it does go on sale very frequently. You can routinely get this for like $20. There's also Story of Seasons, Pioneers of Olive Town. This released in 2021 on the Switch, and so some of the development was during kind of the COVID years, and you can tell. In this game, you're really building your farm from the ground up, and there's all of these like maker machines. I think, to me, it feels very influenced by Animal Crossing. There's a lot of influence that I think went into that. It feels a little derivative, but also clunky at the same time. However, it does feature a customizable protagonist. This was a feature that you see in the 3DS era games, but was not present in this one. So people do like the customizable protagonists. And if you don't like any of the marriage candidates from this game, there are DLC marriage candidates. There are 2 from each 3DS game. I like the DLC candidates, but they are DLC candidates. You do need to pay for them. They're like $15 each. And also, what kind of sucks about the DLC marriage candidates is that they do not interact with the town at large, which is kind of sad. Like, I want to do festivals with them. I want to do these things. So finally, the one that is also immediately in your grasp is Story of Seasons, A Wonderful Life. This released fairly recently in 2023 on the Switch. This is also a remake game of Harvest Moon: A Wonderful Life on the GameCube. This time you do have a customizable protagonist, including you can be non-binary. You can use they, them pronouns in this game. This is the first one that allows you to do this. This one, though, it has a marriage candidate who was a character in the original game but was repurposed to be a marriage candidate in this game. But otherwise, it is also a fairly straightforward remake. So I personally visually prefer the look of the original game, but this one, there are mechanic improvements in it. So, the future of Story of Seasons. There are 2 games that are currently in development, and we don't really know a lot about them. That one on the top there, I think we only have art for, and this is supposed to be a Story of Seasons co-op game, and that's basically all we know about it at this point. And then below that, there is a more traditional Story of Seasons game. We have seen a trailer for it. We have not seen any characters. We have barely seen the player character. This one is supposed to be kind of an open world game, and that's basically all that we know about it so far. Okay, sorry. My voice is cracking a lot. So I did have 2 other slides that I can go back and do later because I didn't think I would get through this quickly. But there are 2 other games that I would recommend that I can show you after I get through these things. But so, how I talked about how this game reuses character assets and concepts and names? I really want to kind of demonstrate that for a second. These are all different characters, except 2 of them, which are the same. You may or may not be able to guess. But that first one, that is Anne from the original Harvest Moon Super Nintendo version. She is the progenitor Anne. The next one, next to her, is Anne from Harvest Moon 64. In Japanese, she was Nan, and then that was translated as Anne in English. Harvest Moon 64 Anne works on a ranch with her father and her brother Gray. Gray is a rancher in this game. He is not a blacksmith. The next Anne, that is Back to Nature and Friends of Mineral Town Anne. She works at the inn with her father. She is no longer related to Gray, and she is slightly less tomboyish than she was in Harvest Moon 64. The next Anne, this is Magical Melody Anne. She works at a junk shop with her father. Oop! Surely, you may think this is the same Anne as the progenitor Anne. No. You would be wrong in thinking that, because Magical Melody pulls all these different characters from different games, and it really messes up the timeline to the point where Magical Melody is its own entirely separate entity. This is Harvest Moon DS Anne. So if you play Harvest Moon DS and you play it on your DS and you insert a copy of Harvest Moon Friends of Mineral Town into the Game Boy slot on your DS, characters from Mineral Town can come over and visit, because Mineral Town is right next to Forget-Me-Not Valley, which is next to it. And so because she's coming over from Mineral Town, she must be the same Anne as Mineral Town Anne, isn't she? No. This is actually, in Japanese, she is Afi, not Anne, because in Harvest Moon DS, they kind of changed this in the English release, but in the Japanese version, Harvest Moon DS takes place in the same setting as Harvest Moon: A Wonderful Life, except it is 100 years later from A Wonderful Life, and the characters in the town all have the exact same appearances and jobs and everything as their ancestor characters from A Wonderful Life. Nothing has changed about this town. And so this is actually the grandchild of Back to Nature Anne. And this final one, this is the same Anne as Harvest Moon, Back to Nature, and Mineral Town Anne. Those are the only 2 that are the same. You can kind of tell because they're in the same pose in their character art. Otherwise, these are all different Annes. Yeah, in the Japanese, in Japanese, her name was Nan, and then in English they changed it to Anne. But in the Switch remake, they reverted back to her Japanese name, which is Nan, but I think a lot of people read it as Ran. It is, yeah. And this series is full of stuff like this. So, and also, I still have some time, so I'm going to talk about some of the other weird things in this series, because there's a lot of it. So, I just talked a little bit about kind of the generation difference between A Wonderful Life and Harvest Moon DS. And so in Harvest Moon DS, in the English release, they changed it so that all of the names reverted back to their A Wonderful Life names, but they did not update the script in any ways. And so sometimes characters will refer back to their ancestor characters, like in this case, but it's really confusing because he's in this house and he's like, He's referring to his grandfather, Gustafa, but he is also Gustafa. So he's like, it's a cool house, isn't it? I heard a man named Gustafa built it. Also, I am Gustafa. And there's a lot of instances of that in Harvest Moon. Harvest Moon DS was so weird. I play Harvest Moon DS. It is so stupid. And I say that lovingly, but like, it's so funny. And then also with Gustafa in Harvest Moon, A Wonderful Life, if you marry him, when you go around to kind of announce your marriage to the town, there's a glitch in which he will scoot around on his butt as you walk around to do this. Because usually he's often sitting playing an instrument. He does not bother to stand up to announce his marriage. He just scoots around. Also, I want to talk about Golden Lumber. Also, AC, I'm going to talk to you about Golden Lumber later because this is going to be relevant eventually. So, in Harvest Moon, Friends of Mineral Town, I believe it's on Winter 3, the Mayor Thomas will come to you and he's like, hey, I made a bet with a mayor in another town and I need you to bring me this item. And if you bring him whatever item he requests, I believe in year 1 it's always green pepper, so you can plan ahead for it. But if you give him that item, he will give you a piece of golden lumber in exchange. And golden lumber is the single most expensive item in the game. A single piece of golden lumber costs the maximum amount of currency that you can have at any given time. And so he'll give you this piece of golden lumber. But if you do anything with it, such as, God forbid, put it in your yard to decorate, the entire town will come out one by one to yell at you. And they will do this every single day until you remove the piece of golden lumber from your yard. And if you go into town to talk to them, they will be very passive aggressive. Like, they hate you, including Mayor Thomas, who gave you the piece of golden lumber in the first place. It is a very long cutscene where everyone comes one by one to talk to you. Here's another weird translation thing. So in Harvest Moon Magical Melody, your farming rival Jamie has this really evil looking dog. And in Japanese, this dog is named Cerberus. I don't know what happened in English. Something happened along the way. Also, in Harvest Moon, Friends of Mineral Town, there is a scene where the character Cliff will pass out and he stays in the clinic in the bed for a couple days while he recovers. If you, the player character, pass out in that time, they take him out of the bed and they will drag him off so that you can use the bed. This is Ellie dragging Cliff off because they only have one bed in the clinic. So basically, the TLDR of this whole panel is that I really love these games and all of their weird little quirks. And I hope that you do too. A lot of you guys came out to this panel, and I think that most of you have probably played a Harvest Moon game, but if you haven't, please do, and please talk to me about it, because I really like these, and I have thought about this for the past 20 years. Also, I have been asked to advertise a Harvest Moon and Rune Factory and Stardew Valley Discord roleplay server. There are people in the audience who I roleplay with. Hi, guys. I've been asked to advertise this. We write as canon characters from the series. We have a lot of characters. We also have a lot of open characters. If this is something that you are interested in and you like writing, you can come up and talk to me afterwards. I'll get you a link. Anyway, questions. Ask me things. Yes, AC.
Yes. Are you going to talk about Kappa?
Oh, the Kappa? Kappa would be his own entire slide. Yeah, there's the Kappa is another weird thing in the series. He is kind of the foil to the harvest goddess, and you can throw a cucumber in the pond to summon him. He is a character that you can marry, but he will never live with you. You can still have a child with the Kappa. He is not an involved father, however. Yes. Purple shirt guy.
You said you had 2 slides you were going to go over. Do you have time?
Yes. Let me pull out my slides. I hid them. Let me unhide them. It's 2 other slides for games that I would also recommend if you are willing to buy games secondhand. So the other 2 that I would recommend would be Harvest Moon Animal Parade. This released on the Wii. This is another game that reuses character assets from the game that came before it, which was Harvest Moon Tree of Tranquility. I prefer Tree of Tranquility's characterization in many ways, but most people prefer Animal Parade. One of the big reasons is that it has a very robust rival marriage system, and the rival couples can also have kids that have distinct designs and personalities and will grow up alongside your kids. And so people really like that because it makes the town feel a lot more fleshed out. I would recommend honestly playing this on an emulator though, because everything is very spread out and it's very slow, and so being able to speed things up is very helpful. The other one that I would recommend is Story of Seasons Trio of Towns on the 3DS. This released in 2017. If you've ever played Rune Factory 4, what you will find is that it is very hard to find repeat dialogue in Rune Factory 4. And Trio of Towns is the exact same way. There is so much dialogue, there is so many different cutscenes. The characters really feel like fully fleshed out people, which I can't say for every Harvest Moon game. In a lot of games, the characters feel more like archetypes, and again, I say that lovingly, but in Harvest Moon Trio of Towns, they really feel like fully fleshed out people. And this also has pretty substantial crop growing and whatnot. And so you can play this for a very, very long time. So those were the other 2 games that I would recommend. I've played nearly every Harvest Moon game to some degree, but those are the ones that I would recommend if you are either completely new to the series or if you are re-entering it and wanting to play something that is very highly rated. So, yeah. Very back, you have a bracelet on your wrist.
It's not a Harvest Moon thing, but it's mostly a farming sim cozy game question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think they should bring back your villagers in Animal Crossing auto-leaving and not having to ask? Do you think they're strong enough for that?
I mean, it makes me sad when they leave on their own, but I like towns that feel like they can exist without me as the player character being in charge of everything. That's why people like Harvest Moon Animal Parade so much, because it feels like the town is also growing and not just you as the player character. So in Animal Crossing, it would make me sad, but I would be okay with villagers leaving on their own because I want the town to exist without me. Yeah. Black sleeves.
Yeah. So while I love Stardew Valley, but I grew up with the Harvest Moon Story Seasons games. So my favorites are Grand Bazaar and Tales of Two Towns. And I love those because they're so different. Grand Bazaar doesn't even have a shipping thing. And they used to do such different things, and I feel like once Stardew Valley kind of came in, things got a little more standardized, not just within story seasons, but in many games.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, unlimited budget, balls to the wall, what are some weird features you would either love to see brought back into a story seasons game, or that you haven't, that hasn't really been there recently that you would love to see kind of change the genre of it?
So I would say that Western fans say this a lot. I would like to see the return of rival marriage. Rival marriage was a feature that was removed a few games ago. It still kind of exists in some games, but the other rival couples can't actually get married, so there is no end point of this. I would like to see the return of rival marriage. I do like the more fleshed out crop growing systems. I like it in Trio of Towns a lot because you have to work to really get these 5-star crops and all of these things. I do also like the hybrid crops in A Wonderful Life, but it is fairly confusing. And if you're trying to if you want a game where you can really min-max things, that's not the way to do it. I liked Grand Bazaar. I liked the bazaar. In Grand Bazaar, you can only sell things once a week at this bazaar marketplace. I would not have the item freshness feature, though. I hate that.
I love it.
I don't like it. So I guess those are the main things I would want to see the return of rival marriages first and foremost. So, fursuit, head, dog.
What's your favorite romance costume?
I'm so glad that you asked this. Baby's first husband was Gray in Friends of Mineral Town. I love him very much, but my favorite overall would probably be Gil from Tree of Tranquility and Animal Parade. So, Sonia.
What Harvest Moon characters or Moon Factory characters have you cosplayed as?
Right now, I am Potpourri in her Switch remake design. I will pull up, because I had a slide that I hid for this. So I've cosplayed Potpourri. I've cosplayed Claire, the player character from Back to Nature and Mineral Town. I have cosplayed Celia, or she was changed to Cecilia in the Switch remake. I have, the day before yesterday, I was Micah, who was the Rune Factory 3 protagonist. I would also, just since you're here, I would also recommend Rune Factory games. If you want to play a farming sim game, Rune Factory is very fantastic, and there is a new game that is coming out very soon. Anyway, yeah. I'm cosplaying Potpourri in her remake design there. So, who else have I cosplayed? I don't know. I've lost track. I will do a lot more, though, so. Hat guy.
So my first Harvest Moon game was It's a Wonderful Life Special Edition on PS.
Oh, on the PlayStation one.
I've heard a lot of people be very down on it.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering, what actually is the difference?
So in the PS2 Special Edition of A Wonderful Life, you can marry Lumina, whereas you could not do that in the original A Wonderful Life. They aged her up slightly to make her a marriage candidate. You can marry her in the remake Switch version as well, just at a base level. I have not played the Special Edition, but my understanding is that it has really massive issues with lag and load times and whatnot, and that seems to be what people get very upset about. So.
I think it also came out on PS3 and 4 to fix the lag issues, from what I've heard.
Oh, like a virtual console thing. Back there, yeah, you just looked back. I have not played River King. River King is a fishing game that was also developed, or at the very least, it was published in North America by Natsume, and I have to operate under the assumption that it was developed either by Victor Interactive or Marvelous. I would like to, but yeah, River King is a fishing game that is very similar, or it has some similarities with the Harvest Moon series. So, yes.
So I got into playing the farming sims from Stardew Valley and
Mhm.
everything, and I'm a huge Digimon fan.
Mhm.
Love the sims of just like taking care of your animals and everything.
Mhm.
I wanted to ask, what game do you think has like the best like animal sim to it?
So the question that he was asking, so he says that he really likes Digimon and raising Digimon and kind of the care aspect of that, and was asking if there are other if there are Harvest Moon games that have similar features. And the answer is no, not really. Not to the extent that like a Digimon game would have. I've only played Digimon Dawn on the DS. That's the only Digimon game that I've played. But I did have like a little Digimon toy when I was little. I would, however, if you like kind of the fighting aspect, I would recommend like a Rune Factory game to you, because you can tame these monsters in dungeons and you can bring them with you and they will level up and fight alongside you.
Yeah, I played 4. That's my favorite one personally. But just like in the actual mainline series of Digimon and the World games, like World 1, you were talking about like raising a town and everything. It's actually like that where you raise a Digimon and you help the town and it grows, and you're able to like help different Digimon too in a similar sense. So I was kind of interested in seeing like maybe there's like a through line between them.
Honestly, I would say that the crop growing systems in the series have been a lot more expanded upon versus the animal care series. I mean, you can do things like, brush your animals and wash them and milk your cows and things like that to varying degrees, but and give them treats. Like there are ways, there's like combinations of treats that you can give them in certain games to like level up their product, but it's just not really the same degree as like a Digimon game, for example. So
Monster Rancher.
yeah, that seems maybe it would be more kind of along your speed. But if you wanted something kind of adjacent to this, I would recommend like Rune Factory games where you can bring monsters and stuff. So, all right, we've got 5 minutes left, so I can take maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Headband guy.
You mentioned for the future of the series, you mentioned 2 games under the Story of Seasons name. How about the Natsume-Marvelous series? Is there any update on what the future holds for that series?
So the most recent original Harvest Moon game that Natsume released was a mobile game. I don't know the name of it off the top of my head. I think it had like a base cost of like $15 to $20. I have heard that it's not horrible, but I also don't want to play things on my phone, so I will not personally do that. Before that, there was a Switch game that released, I think, maybe 2 years ago. So they will often, again, release games to coincide with Story of Seasons games, which creates further confusion. I don't hone in as much on their games, but I do know that the most recent one was a mobile game. So, yes.
I guess which game would you say that you have the most hours put into?
So the question was, which game have I put the most hours into? I would say Story of Seasons Trio of Towns, which is the one that I showed a little bit ago. That one. This I have put so much time into because there are so many cutscenes. It takes a very long time to unlock everything, and you really have to kind of plan ahead for it. So I don't know off the top of my head how many hours I've put into it, but this is probably what I've put the most time into. So, very, very back.
Yeah, I was just wondering, so you said that the Harvest Moon games in America, or the Story of Seasons games in America, kind of climb in popularity early. They're not getting new players. Is that true in Japan too with
The Bokujo Monogatari series. So, oh, like, is the question like, are the Japanese?
Japan too, basically, is the question.
So, I don't have nearly as much insight into this because the split did not happen in Japan. But I would say at least, and I don't have a super tangible answer to this, but at least as an observer, as someone who is online and as someone who also follows a lot of Japanese people within this fandom, they also tend to veer a lot older. And I think that oftentimes it's games like Rune Factory that are pulling in the new players, and much less so games like the Bokujo Monogatari games. Again, I don't have hard numbers on this. This is just observational. I will say that recently a lot of Japanese people that I follow have been playing My Time at Sandrock. That seems to be that's had a big kick recently. So, but again, I just don't have any super hard numbers. This is all observational on my part. Yeah. I can do one more question. Yes, Black Sleeves.
So, have you ever played the Doraemon Story of Seasons game? And how much do you think it compares like the mainline?
I have not played the Doraemon Story of Seasons game. So Doraemon is a Japanese children's show, and there were these crossover Story of Seasons Doraemon games that are very story heavy. You cannot get married in them because you play as a child. Visually, I think they look beautiful, and I would love to play them. But I don't have the nostalgic attachment to Doraemon that like a Japanese child would have. Or my understanding is that Doraemon also came out in Europe in various countries. And so European players seem to have latched onto it a lot more than the North American players. So I have not played it, but I do know that they are very, very well received. So. And that was all the time that I have. But if you want, again, thank you so much for coming. I know that my voice is creaky and I spoke very fast, but